There's no surprise today, the beginning of 2026, the geopolitical games are getting way more complicated than ever. And perhaps that if we follow the news closely, not recently, make no mistake, pay attention not only to the rhetorics of the politicians and also about interpretation of the words. Lately, if you follow the social media and you understand that Secretary of State Marco Rubio made a strong statement at the Board of Peace Summit. Now, keep in mind, it's not again about the words that the Secretary Rubio said. It's really about the interpretation and also the strong reaction within the international community. And for example, let's listen to some of the strong statement from Secretary Rubio and during the summit.
Because the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, has both an ability and a willingness to use the power of his office to think outside the box. And that's why we're here today. This was a very unique crisis in Gaza, one that the existing international institutions could not solve or figure out. It needed a very specific type solution that required the partnership of all the nations that are here, including those that are here on an observer status. And we appreciate you coming today and being a part of this as well. And that's the point I want to drive home today. And soon you'll hear from Steve and Jared, who, by the way, deserve an incredible amount of credit for pulling this together and working countless hours and traveling all over the world. They truly deserve our appreciation and thanks for the work they've put in under the leadership of President Trump to make this possible. This Gaza situation was impossible to solve under orthodoxy, under existing structures.
How do we understand that? It's one thing that we read the words or listen to the words from the politicians, again, but it's something else we need to understand the policy and also the strategies under the Trump administration, especially regarding countries in Asia. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Paul Poast. Professor Poast is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago, where his area of research and teaching is international relations. Well, Professor Poast, and welcome back to The Amazing Piece, and Happy New Year to you.
Oh, Happy New Year to you, and thank you for having me back on the podcast.
Absolutely. It's my honor to do so. Now, again, Professor Poast, as I mentioned before, again, when we follow the social media or the media, this Board of Peace under the Trump administration, it's making more noises and the political waves from the left to the right. Now, again, according to the statement under the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, it's not just about solving the crisis. It's more about rebranding the image of America and also to strengthen the relationship. And we know that today when we talk about the relationship, especially the partners or the allies in Asia, we talk about Japan, we talk about South Korea. So from your perspective, Professor Poast, what do you make of the whole creation of the Board of Peace, and especially including some of the critical members in Asia? Let's start from there. Your thoughts.
So this is, to put everything in context, is you read the opening, those remarks made by Secretary Rubio at the first major meeting of this Board of Peace. And of course, President Trump also offered a number of remarks yesterday, in terms of timing of this recording here, that this all happened yesterday. And so we're talking about this. And this is the big open question right now, is what exactly is the goal of this institution? And I think your question goes right to the heart of that, because the idea of the Board of Peace was originally just supposed to be limited to the reconstruction of Gaza. This was part of the 20-point plan that was put forward for the ceasefire of Gaza or the war in Gaza, where phase one was just purely the ceasefire, hostage releases. Phase two is where we're moving into now. Phase three is supposed to be the reconstruction of Gaza. And phase two is more about the disarmament of Hamas and kind of taking further steps to ensure that the war, that there isn't just a ceasefire, but that there's not a restart of the war. So you can kind of think about the three phases of the peace plan in that way, that it was like, first one was just to stop the fighting. Second one was to prevent the fighting from restarting. And the third phase is really about the reconstruction of Gaza. And this Board of Peace was intended to be international institution that would oversee the reconstruction of Gaza, where the actual day-to-day operations of the reconstruction would be carried out by this institution. And I always forget the name. I always look it up and then I forget the name, but it's basically like the governing committee, and it's a committee that's made up of Palestinians, though there's still a question about the extent to which Palestinians who are actually in Gaza would have membership on this board. But the idea is supposed to be that they would be carrying out the day-to-day nature of the rebuilding, and then this board of peace would be overseeing that and also playing a fundraising role in terms of helping to generate the revenue that would be needed, or the foreign aid that would be needed actually to rebuild Gaza. And that's a substantial task, because current estimates from the UN is anywhere from 50 to 70 to even $100 billion with a B to be able to rebuild Gaza. And it's going to take years, decades maybe. So this is a long-term commitment to be able to try to build and rebuild Gaza, let alone just the issue of trying to prevent war from breaking out again. So I bring all that up just to say that's the original context in which this thing was created. And that is also represented in many ways by what was envisioned as the original membership of this committee, that the original membership would be comprised largely of countries that would have a stake in the rebuilding of Gaza. So that would be countries in the Middle East, including Israel. You would have UAE, you would have Turkey playing a big role, Saudi Arabia playing a big role. And of course, these are also countries that also played a role in brokering the ceasefire itself. So they would be memberships. That makes a lot of sense. But what happened was Trump started to think, well, gee, this could be bigger than that, right? And of course, Trump has made no mistake of the fact that he desires a Nobel Peace Prize. And so, and he's made it known that, at least in his mind, he has solved 8 wars so far during his second term in office. And of course, we could debate the extent to which he has truly solved those wars. But nevertheless, he started to say, oh, well, maybe this Board of Peace could play a broader role in peace building, in preventing conflict, in stopping conflict. And that started to raise questions about the extent to which is this intended to be a substitute to the UN Security Council. Now, interestingly enough, I think some of the speeches yesterday, some of the commentary yesterday kind of addressed that question. First of all, it's important to recognize that the peace plan for Gaza was authorized by the UN Security Council itself. And that was the plan that, of course, creates the Board of Peace. So in that respect, the UN Security Council has actually authorized the creation of the Board of Peace. But they also addressed about how it's intended to help the UN. Trump talked about this, that, he's like, I like the UN. I think the UN needs to do more. And then he started going on his whole thing about the teleprompter not working and, the escalator last time he was at the UN. But he talked about how, in his view, he thinks that the UN is suffering from a financial shortage, which it is. Part of that is due to the US's own making, and that the Board of Peace could potentially play a role in helping to bolster the UN and the UN Security Council. Now, you and I could get into whether it would actually serve that role, whether it would, and my view is that it can't. It won't be a substitute for the UN Security Council. But again, I just wanted to kind of provide that as a context. And it is the case that there are countries beyond the Middle East who have already expressed interest in joining or have already accepted invitations to joining the Board of Peace. These are countries in South Asia like Pakistan. These are countries in Southeast Asia like Indonesia, right? You also have countries in Latin America, such as El Salvador and Argentina. Now, of course, it turns out that the presidents of both of those countries are also good friends of Trump. So it's not surprising. You also have some countries in Europe that have already accepted invitations, such as Hungary, Bulgaria. So you have already more countries joining than just the original vision of these are countries with a direct stake in the rebuilding of Gaza. And so in that sense, it's moving forward. But it's notable the countries that are not currently members of it. Maybe they've expressed interest, but they're at this point at best observers to it. They've maybe had invitations, but they haven't really taken up this. And these are countries like Japan. These are countries that are also UN Security Council members, like Russia, China. So, it's an open question about whether the key countries that are currently making up the UN Security Council and just key countries in general in the world, countries like India as well, would actually become members of this for it to be able to serve this broader purpose.
Well, again, Professor Poast, interestingly that you mentioned several critical countries in Asia. We talk about Japan, South Korea, and China. Now, let's break it down little by little. Let's talk about China first. Again, even though White House has not confirmed this piece of news yet, but rumors on the street that sitting US President Donald Trump is expected to visit China at the early April. Again, this is going to be a groundbreaking trip for both countries. I mean, not only we're looking at this intensity of this political tension between the two countries, and also, again, just related to what you talk about, the issue in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, and also the chaos in the Middle East. I mean, the list can go on and on and on. But meanwhile, let's talk about the relationship between US and China at this moment. So that going to lead me to the next question is, a lot of US officials believe or emphasize that the only way to prevent China from dominating Asia was the United States and allies and partners to make a major investment in the region's political, economic, and military stability. So, Professor Poast, again, we're looking at, for example, the ongoing tension between China and Japan right now. And also, we discussed that how China has navigating itself with the relationship with South Korea. So from your perspective, what do you make of that right now at this moment? Again, as you mentioned before, having the Border Peace Summit and lay out the groundwork and mentioning all the crises and giving the credit or this whole a profound speech about UN, China was listening too. And China was very much interested in contributing as well. So prior to this trip or before Donald Trump make the trip, how do you think that we should assess the relationship between US and China at this moment? Is it still a mutual reciprocity, or there should be bigger expectations from the US towards China so China is able to play a bigger role, not only for the UN Security Council, but also perhaps, hey, welcome aboard the Board of Peace. What do you say to that?
And so there's a lot that we could unpack in terms of your question there, because it's really going to the heart of, if you will, maybe the key question in the world today, which is the U.S.-China relationship. And in particular, going back to the first question of what does it mean for this Board of Peace?
Right.
And, first of all, yes, the word on the street is that Trump is going to China in April, and that word is also by Trump himself. He brought that up briefly during his address yesterday. He said, yeah, I'm going to be going there in April. I mean, to the extent it's been worked out and all the details,
right.
It's still to be seen, but it does seem like he wants to do that. Of course, he recently also met with Xi during his trip through Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, a few months ago. And so he, also met with Xi then. Made several remarks we could talk about Xi, promising not to ever take Taiwan as long as he's president, things of that nature. But yeah, he takes pride in the fact, and he even bragged about it again, that he has a good relationship with Xi. It's very similar language that he uses when he talks about Putin. He talks about, he's tough, he's a strong leader, but I have a good relationship with him. I know how to work with him. And so from a personal standpoint, it seems like he desires to have a good relationship. And thinks that that is key for the U.S. and China to be able to avoid some of the bigger problems that they could face going forward. So that's one thing I think is important to put out there is, yeah, your the word on the street about Trump wanting to have this other meeting is very much true, and it's consistent with his view that the personal relationships are really key for U.S. diplomacy, in particular by his personal relationship, him as an individual having these one-on-one relationships. Now, in terms of the broader picture, beyond just Xi, beyond just Trump, it is not clear to me how this Board of Peace is going to play a constructive role in the relationship between China and the United States. And the reason why is because something that Xi has made very clear, and he's made this clear even during his Victory Day speeches, his series of speeches he gave during the Victory Day celebrations, commemorations, if you will, back in the fall for the end of World War II. He gave a series of speeches kind of talking about his vision for China going forward in light of the fact that we're 80 years past World War II. And he makes a point of multilateralism, but he also makes a point of the UN system, viewing that as very important to China. And I think it makes sense that that would be important to China because China has one of the permanent seats on the Security Council. That puts China in a position of influence. It's notable that when the Board of Peace or the Gaza plan was approved by the Security Council, China abstained. So they didn't vote in favor of it, but they didn't vote against it. They abstained. Russia abstained. And, that's a tacit acknowledgement of, okay, we will allow this thing to go forward. We're okay with having this thing go forward. But fundamentally, China really thinks the UN Security Council is the important body. And I also think that most U.S. officials also still view the UN Security Council, maybe not the UN itself. And to be honest with you, even though Trump during his speech yesterday said things like, oh, people weren't happy when I criticized the UN, I actually have said many times, I'm like, that's one of the most mainstream things he has said in foreign policy. If you talk to a lot of IR scholars, they will tell you the same thing in terms of the UN not delivering, being ineffective. And so in many ways, that was like, and not even IR scholars. You think about the UN Security Council, Zelensky, president of Ukraine, leveled the same critique saying, look, you're not being able to solve this. You can't fix this problem. And of course, a big part of that is because of how it's structured. So it's interesting that he talks about the UN security, the UN as not being effective. But again, I think China very much values the UN Security Council, values that seat on the UN Security Council. So China's not going to want to be part of a body where it doesn't have that same type of influence, which the Board of Peace, the way it's structured, Trump has all the influence. So yeah, of course, Trump likes the Board of Peace and it's all great, but I don't see where other countries are going to view it as this attractive body as a substitute to the UN Security Council. They may join the Board of Peace, and again, it seems like it could play a constructive role in terms of helping to generate foreign aid, and it seems like it can be useful in that, but it's by no means going to be a substitute. And so in that sense, I don't see how it'll ultimately play any type of constructive role in U.S.-China relations.
Professor Poast, I have two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about another critical word, especially we'll look at the Trump administration strategy towards Asia or even perhaps the world. Looking back, during the first term for Donald Trump, I think the word was loyalty. Everything was so crucial to Donald Trump. Not only we talk about the cabinet member choices, we're looking at, again, this whole debate with James Comey, and also with other key cabinet members. But for the second term, if I'm not mistaken, I think Donald Trump was looking for, or perhaps he has already found it, the word is called commitment. And it's not just about staying authentic to the U.S., but also have this total dedication or this wholehearted a complete commitment to the effort, the contribute for the greater cause. Now, with that said, you and I last time we had a conversation about, again, Japan and South Korea, many more. But I want to talk about another crucial topic that Donald Trump and hopefully will continue to stay committed, which is the strategy to deal with North Korea. And we know that North Korea, it's so crucial for US at this moment. And so that's why, Donald Trump cannot afford to play a risky card with China, because North Korea is still very concerning to Japan, to South Korea. So Professor Post, from your perspective, when we think about North Korea, we think about the nuclear weapons, we think about the ongoing unstoppable missile testing. But there's another perspective, is this military commitment or this military shakeup. Again, the question to you is, what is the current analysis from your perspective regarding US and North Korea at this moment? As China, it's celebrating the Chinese New Year right now. And one thing I can tell you that by traveling throughout the country, it's rather terrifying to have people to say, please, we don't want any surprises from North Korea. We don't want to hear anything bad from North Korea because it's just not the right time. It's just not the right season. So again, Professor Post, from your perspective, I believe this reaction from China really echoes the reaction from Japan and also North Korea. But again, let me go back to the question. What say you about North Korea and US at this moment? Are we still very concerned about this? Or perhaps this board of peace are going to bring tangible solutions to North Korea, not today, not tomorrow, but soon? What do you say to that?
So the first thing I would say is the folks that you talk to in China, either I read their mind or they read my mind, because that's exactly what I've actually been a little surprised, because Kim Jong-un if there's one thing that he does very well, is say, I will not be ignored, right? And it seems like North Korea would always kind of stir the pot, launch some missiles, make some demands whenever they felt like they weren't being paid attention to, right? And I know that sounds kind of paternalistic and so forth, but I think it's true that it's like if they feel like the attention is off of them and they're not being taken seriously in terms of their demands, then there was a propensity for Kim Jong-un to authorize some sort of something, again, missile launches or making threats or military exercises, but something to kind of get the attention. And so I think it's interesting that it's you're hearing the same thing from folks throughout China of just stay quiet right now.
That's right.
We're trying to fix a lot of this other stuff. And, especially when you look at all the other things happening in the world right now, the last thing we need is another nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula, right? Which, of course, happened during the first Trump administration in 2017. And that's something that even his Secretary of Defense at the time, James Mattis, writes about how he thought we were on course for war with North Korea. He was very concerned about that. And eventually that situation was resolved. And I think it was resolved because I do think China played a constructive role in that situation, in that crisis. My understanding is that, the Chinese government had issued a statement saying essentially that they will defend North Korea unless North Korea does something to provoke the United States. Then, we're not obligated to prevent. And I think that kind of tamped things down a little bit. But it's just a situation they don't need to deal with right now. And I've actually been a little surprised, given everything else that's been going on in the world, Venezuela, Iran, Greenland, efforts in Ukraine. He's been all over the place, so much so that Sean Hannity, who is a Fox News celebrity, Fox News commentator, he's a fan of Trump. He's someone that Trump likes to be interviewed by. They did a recent interview where Hannity was like, you seem very focused on foreign policy. And, as a criticism. He was saying, you seem very focused on foreign policy. How is that America first, right? And then Trump didn't really answer the question. But I bring that up to say that it's Trump has been very engaged in foreign policy. He's been doing all sorts of things. Some of it has been stuff he's been trying to address. Some of it have been problems of his own making. But it is notable that North Korea has not been one of those areas, even though during his first term, it was actually a priority. He made a point of meeting with Kim Jong-un. He made a point of wanting to try to denuclearize the peninsula and get North Korea to give up their nuclear weapons. And there's questions about the extent to which he followed up with that. But even Trump's harshest critics during the first term were like, there's nothing wrong with him actually meeting, him and Kim meeting. Like, there was nothing wrong with that. It was a good constructive attempt. Like, let's give this a try, because we've tried everything else to get North Korea to get rid of their nukes, and this might as well try this. So I think it's notable. I think it's a great question, because for me, it's like, yeah, why aren't we talking about North Korea? And I say that not to say that we should be talking about North Korea, but more of to say, I'm surprised North Korea hasn't done something make us talk about them right now.
That's right. Well, again, Professor Poast, I do want to wrap up our conversation by asking the last question. Everyone is still very concerned about the war in Ukraine. And last time, as you mentioned before, President Trump and the Chinese president had a brief encounter a few months ago during the APEC summit. I mean, again, something related to Ukraine was brought it up. And of course, we know that how much Trump enjoyed posting messages on social media. And he slightly mentioned that China was very much interested in helping with the war in Ukraine. Now, 2026, I believe we're still in this phase of fatigue when we look at the war in Ukraine. So the last question to you, Professor Poast, is where do we go from here? Because China, it's not going to be a bench player. China has a good economic relationship with Ukraine, and also China has both personal diplomatic relationship with Russia. And in other words, economy, it's crucial for China. And China cannot afford to be a bench player when it comes to the war in Ukraine. So I want to hear your final thoughts. What can we expect? And is China going to step in? Perhaps this is maybe something that will be brought it up again during the trip in April for Trump to China, or maybe even perhaps some of the few issues were to be discussed before the trip. So we're looking at these hypothetical scenarios. But again, by asking around and talking to the a few folks and experts in Asia or in China in particular, they still want to know, what role does the U.S. expect China to play when we look at the war in Ukraine? Your final thoughts.
Yeah, so I have a piece I just wrote in my weekly column for World Politics Review, and this week's piece is about the fact that next week is end of February here is going to be the 4-year anniversary since the full invasion of Ukraine. And we are nearing the point where the war in Ukraine will be the longest continuous theater of battle in Europe since the Napoleonic Wars, even going back to World War II, because World War II was kind of a series of interconnected wars, but not one continuous war. And so the war in Ukraine, by June, will be longer than World War I. And in terms of this, fighting. And the reality is that it's not, I don't yet see where there's a solution. I don't yet see where there will be a willingness of the sides to back down, to reach an agreement, to stop the fighting. I know this is something that Trump's been trying to obviously achieve. He said he would do it on day one of being president, and obviously now he says, I was exaggerating, I was just, but it's like, no, you seem pretty serious about that. And then the question becomes, okay, the U.S., Trump's been trying, you can't get this done. Is there anything that someone like, say, a country like China could play, especially given the relationship that China has with Russia? The fact that China has, through purchases of oil, through continued trade of certain technologies and parts, has enabled Russia to continue fighting, right?
That's right.
China has not given the direct military aid that, say, North Korea has given. So going back to North Korea, they've sent troops, they've sent missiles. You've had Iran sending drones. But China has given Russia a bit of a lifeline by being willing to continue to purchase Russian energy. India's done the same. There's a slew of countries that have done this, and dual use technology. And so what that would point to is a very obvious area where China could play a role is, would China be willing to just cut that off and say, you know what, that's it. We're not going to trade with Russia anymore until the war's over. That would be a point of leverage that China would have. But I think China could have pulled that lever a long time ago, and they've chosen not to. Now, the question is why? I don't think Xi is a fan of the war in Ukraine. I don't think he is. I think he would have rather there not have been a war in Ukraine. And not because he's opposed to war itself, but because it does create a complicated situation, right? Where it's like, okay, this is now happening. We want to build up better relations with Russia because we view Russia as potentially useful in global competition with the United States. But now Russia is engaging in this war with Ukraine, and we can't fully criticize it because if we do that, then people are going to use that against us with our own, say, with Taiwan and so forth, because a lot of the rhetoric Russia is using could be rhetoric that Xi could use in terms of Taiwan, that, you know, from Putin's standpoint, Ukraine is just part of Russia, right? And it should be part of Russia. Same thing with Xi view towards Taiwan. It's just part of China and we should have control of it. So I think it's always been kind of a complicated situation for them. But nevertheless, they've been supporting Russia. And I think ultimately it is because partially they feel like they need Russia. I feel like China feels like they need Russia to balance against the United States, to kind of create an alternative order relative to the United States. You know, some people have referred to this as the axis of resistance, but, you know, nevertheless, I think this is the view. I think this is also why Trump has tried to cozy up to Russia, because he views it the other way. We need to have Russia to balance against China. And because of that, he's been unwilling to like cut Russia off. So I think that there is a clear path where China could play a role in helping end the war. But in doing that, they would undermine a key component of the larger global great power competition that they're engaged in with the United States. And so I think that is why China has not gone so far as to cut off economic exchange with Russia as a way of pressuring them to end the war.
Well, again, Professor Poast, we're looking at a very sophisticated and also intricate political games at this moment. We don't know what we should expect for the Trump's trip in April. But one thing we do know that China, Russia, North Korea, US, no country is going to be silent. And again, because everyone needs to participate for this bigger picture. Again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor Paul Poast. Again, Professor Poast, it's associate professor at the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Well, Professor Poast, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'd love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay closer attention to the political games today. So thank you so much for doing this.